What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Axioms on Trial. I apologize for the long break that we had. I think it's kind of normal in the holiday season, so hopefully everybody's spent time with their family. Regardless of the religious or non-religious implications, family is a very real thing, unless I guess you're some kind of hard solipsist, and we can get into a different conversation about that. But yes, you spent time with your very real, presumably real family, and that was good, hopefully, for you guys. Cease, how was it for you?
It was great. It was relaxing, nothing too crazy. It was a nice time. Last time I had some technical issues. I ordered the necessary tools to resolve that problem. I'm still waiting for it to come into the mail, but hopefully I won't run into any issues this time around.
The necessary tools, you say. So in a possible world, they wouldn't be any other type of tools. They'd only be those tools.
Only those tools.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
Sweet.
So hopefully I won't run into any issues like last time. But I apologize in advance if I do. But
yeah, no, and that's kind of so. I'm actually gonna bring Jimmy on now. We know Jimmy through Discord for the last, I don't know, it was like 6 months or so. Just kind of chatting back and forth Discord more on a calm, kind of nonchalant type of environment with less of a debate type of format. But we've been wanting to get Jimmy on and have these kind of conversations. Jimmy, did you want to kind of, just before I guess we start, before I keep rambling, do you want to kind of give the viewers just a little basis on your positions, anything that you feel is necessary as a precursor before the conversation actually begins?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I could introduce myself. So I'm Jimmy Stevens. I've not had much really in the way of philosophical training, but I've always been interested in philosophy. I went to Biola for a year, and I've been in and out of college a few times, but never really finished anything. But yeah, so I'm a Christian. I'm roughly in the Reformed evangelical stream of theology, if that means anything to anyone. And was very heavily influenced by Van Til. I went to college, so since then I've had a pretty straightforward Van Tilian outlook on things. I don't like the label presuppositionalist. I don't think it's helpful, but I usually get lumped in with that terminology. So we'll see how it goes. You know, you might lump me in there or not.
Yeah, and that's actually one thing is that when I stumbled upon, but when we kind of reintroduced, kind of came back into conversation with each other, was you were having a conversation with somebody who I guess was like a Clarkian. They were trying to like basically explain to you like, welcome to the brotherhood, and we had a conversation about how I thought that was pretty funny. I'm still working on a video on presuppositionalism for the channel, but I was kind of scouring Discord to hopefully find some conversations, and then I found you two kind of on both sides of what I'm specifically looking at, kind of going back and forth, and I thought that was interesting. But yeah, so I mean, we'll try not to stick with the labels, the presup. We'll stick with the arguments. Me and Cease are very similar in that someone's going to use like the agnostic atheist label in one way, like, or an agnostic in another way. I don't really care how you use the terms. I just want to know what it is you mean by the term so that we can have the discussions. I think people get the terminology. It evades the actual conversation there. But yeah, Cease, I guess I'd kick it off to you if there's anything you kind of want to start it off on, and we can move from there.
Oh, let's get right into it. So we talked about right before the show how we're going to divide this. There's really two main issues that I want to engage with you on. The first is the way that how our opposing worldviews can ground knowledge, and how you make sense of our intelligibility and vice versa. And then stemming from that, the moral argument. From my understanding, your perspective is that without, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but correct me if I'm wrong here. But your perspective, as I understand it, is that without God as a necessary foundation, it's not possible to talk about facts or to ground our understanding of the world in any concrete way. As well as, I think you mentioned to me that from your point of view, the atheistic perspective can't account for moral objectivity. And so I would like to see how you defend those positions, and then I'll give my response, and we can go back and forth.
Sure. Okay. You would just like me to go ahead and present those?
Just present. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, as a Christian, I think the key difference that you'll find between a Christian outlook and a non-Christian outlook is that there's this idea in the Bible that God is the creator, that this universe is a created universe, and that the universe displays itself as his handiwork. So you think of like Psalm 19, where it begins to describe the heavens declaring the glory of God. And that sort of idea is found variously stated all throughout the Psalms, that the world is God's world. It's a world that causes us to stand in awe before what he's done. And that kind of reasoning, you see it pop up, for example, in like Job 28, when Job is poetically asking questions. Who can dig up real knowledge? Who can mine for wisdom about the universe? And he appeals to God's handiwork again, saying that the Lord, the one who creates the world, is the one who knows the purpose and the place of all the things that are in the world. He's the one who can tell you what's going on, what the whole story is. That kind of idea pops up in Ecclesiastes, where the sort of philosophical author of that work is looking out into the world, and he almost sounds like a philosophical pessimist. He looks out and he says, in the place of justice, I see injustice. I see men who build great works, and they come to crumble in the next generation. The wise person's stuff goes to the fool, and it's destroyed. There's all this futility and mayhem in the world that we have no control over. Who can explain it? And again, his appeal is, well, God knows the times and places of all things. He's set eternity in the heart of man, meaning he's set desire for this creator, desire for this story that the creator has, but no man can utter it. No man can go out and find it by himself. And then I think that idea really comes to fruition in Pauline theology in the New Testament, where Paul says, look, the gospel is for everybody. The good news that God has come and died for man on a cross, that Jesus was God paying for the sins of sinners, that's good news for everybody, because everybody's a sinner. And everybody's a sinner because, look, God has revealed his wrath from heaven to all men. He's revealed his wrath against all ungodliness. Everybody knows God. Everybody knows God. And the reason is they're all beholden to his glory in the world. The world has declared its creator. So you have this revelational outlook in Christianity, that really human beings are walking through an atmosphere of revelation. Everything we experience, everything we think about, it belongs to God in this way that communicates that he's there. And I think that not all Christians are in agreement about how clear that revelation is, but I think that's where Reformed Christianity kind of stands out, that from a Reformed perspective, God as a creator, he's not dependent on his world to exist. He's outside the world, and he's responsible for it. And he's so different than the world. He transcends the world so absolutely that there would be no way to just on our own try to use our forces of reason, try to use our powers and categories of thinking to try to reach what God's like, to sort of pierce into him and glean knowledge about him. The only way to really know what God is like is for him to come down into the universe, reveal himself through it. And so for Christians, that's what's gone on in the world. We're surrounded by his glory. So that's the kind of general outlook. That's the kind of general epistemological background that's going on in this conversation.
Okay. So you put a lot there. I'm trying to think where to start. I guess again, and I hope that you don't take any of what I'm saying as an attack. It's just,
no, not at all.
But ultimately, what it comes down to is my perspective is this: that anybody can make claims, right? Anybody can make a syllogism. They can, if X is true, then Y is true. We can all do that. The question that matters to me is how do we support our premises? From my point of view, what you said is all well and good if the Bible is true, but there is no reason, from my perspective, to accept the Bible as revelation. I accept these claims as being any more than imaginary. Now, I'm not saying that I know what the reality is, because I don't believe I have access to ontology in that way. But the claim that we can't attest for sort of the patterns that we see in reality, that we can't ground reason outside of sort of the religious assumption, is something that I think is indefensible, philosophically speaking. Again, I don't have to make a naturalistic approach to make that claim. I can simply say we have no grounds to know one way or another. Now, I can tell you why I think naturalism works and works better, because I think it makes less assumptions. But I'm not tied down to any particular worldview necessarily. And the potential failures of naturalism, and I can recognize that there are some problems with naturalism that we could go over, perhaps, don't on their own give credence to your worldview. So in terms of grounding facts or being able to attest for reality, we have a starting point from my worldview, and that is the cogito. I think, therefore I am. And the way that I understand that, a lot of people say, well, you have to presuppose the laws of logic or language in order to even make any sense of the statement. And that's true, but it's not the only way to interpret the cogito. Like, I interpret it as a performative utterance, as an existential performance. So I can't experience and not exist at the same time. It's incoherent. Now, yes, I use language to make sense of that, to express that idea. But language, from my perspective, is secondary. There's phenomena in our experience of the world, and then we construct languages to try to make sense of the world. So yes, there may be some ambiguity with language. There may be some ambiguity with saying, well, what logic do we apply to see which logic best explains reality? There may be some issues there. Some people look at logic like a language, so the question might not make sense. Like, I was talking to someone that would respond to that perspective with saying, well, if we're describing a tree and we're using the French word for tree or the English word for tree, we're still talking about a tree. Now, I don't know how much I buy into that necessarily. I think it's, there can be some back and forth there. And there's a lot of philosophical work as to why certain logic are preferable to others. It's not that we just presuppose a system and then reality fits the system. I think many of us think that it's reality that informs where our intuitions fail and don't fail. That's why the scientific method actually gets underneath many of our intuitions that turn out to be incorrect.
Well, let me real quick for you two. Could I? Because I think that's a good spot to start.
Yes.
Jimmy, where would you kind of go? Where's your kind of your red flag, so to speak, in what he's saying in terms of grounding logic? I think that's always kind of a good place to start at. Maybe I'm missing the ball on that, but where would you kind of get? Yeah. Where would your path start going off, and then we can kind of all talk about that.
Sure. So I think there's a lot of common ground in that. We agree we want to avoid baseless assumptions. We want to avoid the sort of idea of, hey, let's just assume this and see how well it works out for us, and sort of project our assumptions onto the world. That sounds like a terrible way to do epistemology. It seems also that we want to avoid making certain fallacies, like thinking that certain errors in some system inherently entail some other kind of system just on the face of it. So I think those are things that we agree that we'd want to avoid. the question is, what really does come down to when it comes down to why we think those things are irrational. The question is why, right? Like we can always go back one step and say, well, wait a second, how did we get to thinking that baseless assumptions were bad, or that fallacies are something to be avoided, or something like that? So we can ask general questions about, what constitutes rationality? Why are we to think this way and not the other? And that's really, I think, the same kind of question we're asking when we ask a question like, well, what is logic? Which systems historically should we prefer of logic? And of course, what's the metaphysics of logic? What grounds why something like the law of identity is true, or something like that. So from my perspective, and this gets into when you're talking about not needing a worldview or something like that. It seems to me that from my perspective, when we're talking about rationality, the Bible has really already given it's laid down its cards on the table, so to speak, right? It's already given its perspective on wisdom. I think that's its word for rationality, is this concept of wisdom. And from a biblical perspective, wisdom starts with fear of the Lord. Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So I think the idea there is that human beings have this acquaintance with God. They have this awareness what God is like, who he is, at least vaguely. And because of that, we have this idea of his wisdom. We have this concept that, this is how God thinks about this in an exemplary way. And because of that, we just kind of have an innate sense of, this is a good way to think, and that's a bad way to think over there. And we start reasoning from that point on. So that's how I would ground logic, because I think that God, the Word, has sort of manifested the right way to think for us. We have some inkling of what that's like. And so because of that, we're able to start reasoning about things in a way. But as far as, comparing and contrasting our systems, I think I would agree that your own existence is a necessary condition of reasoning at all, whether you're doubting your existence, or you're thinking about your existence, or you're just thinking, I want a PB&J sandwich right now. Whatever you're doing, your own existence, and I think to some degree knowledge of your own existence is a necessary condition of that. But what I would challenge you on is I don't think it's a sufficient condition for knowledge. It doesn't seem to me that it follows that you can somehow know yourself just because you are thinking. It seems like there's a lot of other conditions that need to be met. And just to offer one, it seems to me like you need the right kind of faculties designed in the right kind of way for that situation to work out. Like if you have an unreliable memory, if you're not able to keep track of your thoughts in sort of a stream of consciousness way, if you have no internal story about what you've been thinking about, then your thoughts are just going to be confusion. You never reason in a way that's
sure. But wouldn't you be able to just rival that with the same idea of that those processes are going to be, I'm going to argue from my worldview that I'm not going to have that capacity without the natural evolution of these things kind of going through, as opposed to like where you kind of sneak in the design. You might argue I'd sneak in the natural processes, for which though I'm appealing to in some way. Like I'm actually using the reality at which I experience to be able to appeal to these processes. I can witness and watch them, right? And so I think that kind of would be the difference there.
And that's a core difference from my perspective, is that, again, much of what you're saying are claims that, from my perspective, are problematic, because I don't feel like, or that seems to me that you have the methodology to ground those claims as supported by the facts. That's the issue. Like I can't be certain that naturalism is, the right system. But I have things that I can point to where I'm deducing that I'm arriving at a conclusion based on experimentation and things that we can actually look at. When you talk about the wisdom coming from the Bible, for someone like myself, that's problematic, because I read the Bible and I see so much of the opposite of that. I see so much barbarism. I see so much what's the word I'm looking for? a collection of documents written in a time of superstition. Now, yes, there are important moral lessons there, but there are also many things that I find completely immoral.
Sure.
And we can get to the moral arguments, following this shortly. But I don't see the Bible as a source of wisdom. I see it as a contradictory, sometimes great, sometimes awful compilation of documents that there were some problems with how it was compiled. And so if you want to say that, I guess what I'm saying is that I'm hearing a lot of claims about what you believe, and I'm particularly interested in the epistemology that gets you to those beliefs. And if you want to say that you believe in God because of the Bible, and you believe in the Bible because of God, that to me is completely circular and doesn't really get off the ground from my perspective.
Yeah. So let me come back to that in just a second. But just to comment, I think you guys are saying something that's actually like very interlocked. Like when Mike says you might argue instead that there's a naturalistic explanation for man's sentience, his sapience. You use the word, you might sneak that in there. And when you say you read the Bible and you find some things to be great and you find some things to be poor, I think both of those point to, hey, there's a contrasting idea of wisdom here. You have a different concept of rationality, and you take that concept, which has its own norms, its own standard for being rational and not, and you apply it to Scripture, and it doesn't meet that standard. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny using your own principles. And that, I think that's totally fair. But then the question becomes, okay, well, which one of us has the right idea of wisdom? Which one of us has the right conception? And I would just say that, well, yeah, I think that as far as how I'm caused to have the beliefs that I have, I do appeal to God's revelation. I think that that's the foremost way that people know that. But I think as far as arguing about this, I think the way we can go about arguing about it is by comparing and contrasting our two accounts and see which one does a better job.
Could I ask you a question
about
that real fast, Jimmy? When it's more just a clarification on maybe why you don't like the term presuppositionalism. Is it because you find yourself appealing to some evidentialist basis in some way, and that's why you like there are some, you're using an evidentialist approach in some way? Not to I'm not trying to pull the rug underneath you or something. I'm just like, is that why? Because you're not just using a presuppositional method to get there. I mean, I know it's a little off topic, but I'm just curious on that.
So I think actually it's convenient that you bring up method, because it seems to me what makes Van Til the reason why apologists sometimes refer to Van Til's approach as the Copernican revolution of apologetics really has little to do, or relatively little to do, with methodology, and much more to do with epistemology. He was really putting forth revelational epistemology, and whatever method you draw from that, there's in-house debates about that. Presuppositionalism is a way of talking about Van Til as a methodology, and I think that's to kind of get the cart before the horse.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of, just that way I understand that part a little bit more, but I don't want to derail what you guys are going into there. Steve, was there anything you wanted to mention, or Jimmy, before I think I cut Jimmy off, actually. So
yeah, the other thing too is that the word presupposition, you often have to define it before every conversation that you go into. I just don't think it's a very useful word, because already at the outset, right, both of us want to avoid making bare assumptions in order to justify our most basic beliefs in an epistemological realm. So clearly that's not the methodology that I'm coming at in my approach. So, but I think people get that idea from the word presuppositionalism. That's not the idea. I think the idea with the word using presupposition is that when we're reasoning, when we're arguing, there are certain things that we have to know that are preconditional to reasoning. I can't reason if I don't know what reason is. I can't reason if I don't know that I exist and that I'm the kind of mind that can reason. I can't reason if I don't know that I'm in a universe that permits the kind of reasoning that I'm doing. So there's all this kind of background knowledge that you already have to have in order to argue that you even have it in the first place. I think that's the idea why it gets called presuppositional. But that's obviously very different than saying let's just assume something and project that onto our experience.
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of the when I was talking with someone in the Discord that you're in. That was kind of our hang up there, right? Was how we, well, at least in the comparison to his worldview. But yeah, I think where you had left it off was kind of comparing those worldviews, and I think Cease might have jumped in on something you wanted to say there.
Yeah, no. What I'll say is the following: that the whole concept of revelation as epistemology is incoherent from my perspective, because there's no. I don't see how you can apply a method to show that this revelation crosses the line between imaginary and actual. So I don't think there is anything that you can describe that somebody else of a different religion couldn't use to argue for the truth of their particular religious ideology, whether it would be deism or polytheism or whatever. Like, revelation to me doesn't seem to be anything but, it's how would I say this? Because you said let's compare and contrast worldviews, right?
Yeah.
My worldview has a track record of explaining things that people already thought they had answers to. Religious people throughout history thought they had the answer about, physical phenomena. They thought that lightning was God angry at them, and then people weren't satisfied with those assumptions, and they applied a more rigorous methodology, and we arrived at knowledge that we wouldn't have otherwise had. So when we compare worldviews, you can point to all the problems you want with science and its method, and all the limitations of talking about the appearance of reality as opposed to what is actually out there, and the limitations of our senses. And I'll probably agree with all those things. And yet, those things, that approach still seems to be the most successful, the one that makes the least amount of assumptions, the one that is least based on circular reasoning or potential fallacies. I'm open to whatever is the case about the world, but when you say that there is a design, I need evidence for that goes beyond, well, the Bible tells me so, because that's not going to convince somebody like myself. And it's not because I want to reject it and live in sin. It's because I don't choose what I find convincing. I need more than that.
Yeah, well, I think if you take a step back for a second and think about this, there really, again, is just two very contrasting views about each of these things. So, like, take your own personal story, right? You're telling the story that you're this rational agent in the world, and you've constructed a worldview that largely explains away a lot of religious answers to things, and you're not against a Christian view from the outset, but you also don't see any particular evidences that pinpoint it as the one true myth, to paraphrase Tolkien.
And just to clarify as well,
yeah, go ahead.
Because there are naturalistic explanations to the failure of our senses, to why people believe certain things, to why people can be certain that they've experienced something and it turns out to be a misconception. I'm not saying that disproves religion. I'm saying that you are left with a set of naturalistic explanations which we have attested to have proven to be actual, not necessarily in that situation, but in general, against a set of claims which may or may not be true, but you have no way to distinguish between a naturalistic explanation or an undiscovered natural explanation, a supernatural one.
Yeah, I would say, like, in a way that I would put it in its simplest form is, like, it seems that you're going to have to separate what's in here and show that it's reflective, right? I don't, like, someone could argue, well, we're using that same methodology to prove methodology. Well, at the end of the day, all we're doing with these kind of conjectures or any type of hypothesis is taking something that's just in your head and seeing if it actually maps out onto reality, right? And so I would say from that perspective, it just doesn't seem like from from that worldview that any of that is mapping to it as we're kind of modeling it as we go. And I come from like a fallibilistic approach, so all of that could be wrong. And I'm already admitting I don't have kind of the metaphysical, the whole baggage kind of filled out there, right? It could be a brain to vat, all those types of things. I'm certain of the quality experience, but at the same time, it's like, I don't see how we get to that being the answer with a methodology that can't distinguish itself from imagination from it. You know what I mean? Like if it's indistinguishable from just something in your head, that seems to be a problem, at least.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think so. What I would say is that there's these really two very different contrasting views of who we are here, right? Like you guys are thinking of yourselves as like these intellectual agents that have constructed naturalistic explanations from things or learned them from other very intelligent human beings. I think there's some truth to that, but the issue is when you say things like we're open to Christianity being proven, we just haven't seen evidences yet. It seems to me that this is really largely to disagree with a Christian anthropology, that from a Christian perspective, right, man is born into a world where God is very clearly experienced through the things that are made, and man is beholden those things. But because of our ancestors, because they first sinned, we've also inherited that sin makeup. We're also sinful. We don't do the right things often. And so we've gone our own way. We've turned away from God, and we substitute idols in his place. So from an intellectual standpoint, on the Christian side, we think of things as like naturalistic explanations as, they're just idols, right? They're just these substitute gods that we don't think do a very good job. So it really seems to me like the question is, in order to say really that you're open to things, you really have to first disprove this story about us being sinners and in the hands of an angry God, to paraphrase Edwards, right? Like there's this story about how we've all messed up. We're beholden to God, but we reject him in our hearts.
I would actually, sorry to cut you. I just feel like though that I could rival that with like infinite amount of things, right? That could be like, it could be the case that all the things that we're seeing are actually an illusion, and the things that are real are there. And I could use that kind of baseline point. Well, I'm going to have to disprove that for that to not be the case. I would take the opposite route and say, well, that actually needs to be demonstrated in order for me to actually to assess that's the case. Because on one side, it seems to be like we could have an infinite series of explanations. And then on one side, we have a process that's going to kind of whittle it down at least, right?
Yeah, so I'm sorry for going on for so long, but it seems to me that that's kind of part of the disagreement, is that like, okay, well, from a Christian perspective, there aren't an infinite list of alternatives. It seems to me like that's actually part of your epistemological system, that you think the universe is so open to explanation. And so it seems to me that part of what's in contest here is to see, whether the Christian worldview or this sort of counter-Christian worldview is right. If the counter-Christian worldview is right, then this objection seems to get off the ground that, hey, I can imagine all these other alternatives that can do the job of Christianity. But you have to remember, from a Christian perspective, like the imagination of man is not a consistent or reliable.
Sure, but what I'm saying is that I could use all those kind of arguments, right, for that worldview. And I don't see, like, it could just be the assertion that I could use exactly what you say about, the world that we're seeing that's not actually the real world, right? And like, for me, it seems to be the case that you're going to have to start from this, what seems to lead to a presupposition that is the only one that's going to account for it. But under any set of circumstances or presuppositions, I could just say that the case about the naturalistic worldview that I presuppose, or something like that, right? And so that seems to be that instead of actually going with what the answer could be in the equation, we're going with what the presupposition of the answer might be. And that seems to be a problem, from at least obviously from my worldview, but it seems to be a problem for the comparison of worldviews, where one's going to produce results and the other is going to kind of have this confirmation bias from the beginning.
And
right.
Two other issues, piggybacking off what you just said, is that I don't have to disprove anything. It's you're making the positive claim. The burden of proof is on the person saying this worldview is true. So I don't need to disprove Christianity. if you can't provide evidence for Christianity in the first place. You're saying now, you may be right in saying that we may be close-minded from your perspective, if your perspective entails that we accept it as a presupposition. So rather than accepting it through the scientific method, that we accept it as, well, this says that this was revealed, and so if it's true, then you just have to accept that it's revealed. If that's the case, then you're right. I'm not going to accept that, because I see no reason to accept that. But if you, on the other hand, if you are rejecting all other possibilities as other idols, you've essentially created a dogmatic barrier around your worldview, where anything that could sort of threaten the legitimacy of your perspective is just going to be shut down as, man-made, or, I don't put words in your mouth, but what it sounds like to me, it's like, oh, it's sort of the devil's game, or it's other idols, like you said, it just seems to me like there's no moving forward from. It's like we're stuck at that point. I don't think I need to, because you're already starting from the premise that it's true, rather than justifying the premise as true. I'm not starting out with the premise that naturalism is true. I'm trying to test whether or not the naturalistic framework actually explains anything, and I'm finding that it does a good amount of the time.
Well, Jimmy, so you kind of perked up when he said that. What would you?
Yeah, so I think I'm doing something a little different. So I think what I'm trying to say is, look, we have these two different stories that we give about ourselves and the universe, right? My story is, look, I'm a sinner, but I'm saved by grace. I was walking away from God, but then when I was confronted by God in Scripture, then I realized my sin, and I repented and followed, and I understood the gospel. So that's my story. But your story is, you don't think that the universe is inherently evidence of God. You're open to Christianity being proven, but it would need to show some kind of special evidences. In the meantime, your wisdom is sufficient on its own from a Christian story. It doesn't need revelation to get off the ground. So we have two very different stories. That's all I'm trying to say. And
Sure.
From there, what I'm saying is, look, I really don't think this is a situation of, let's sit back and be neutral. Let's take a recess from our worldviews and try to see whether evidences can be built up toward one or the other. What I'm saying is, well, these are actually two different stories about how you even build up evidence. These are two different stories about what's possible about the universe, right? In my story,
sure, but doesn't yours kind of come from like a knowing of the metaphysical nature, as opposed to where ours is coming from a position of we don't know the metaphysical nature, therefore all the knowledge is kind of subject to a fallibilistic assessment. Right?
Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
Well, no, I just wanted to ask Jimmy real fast. Like, you would think that that's a very fair flag to plant there, right? Because like when we say these, I agree with you with like comparing like evidence and how we're kind of coming to these conclusions. But wouldn't it be fair to also point out that like we don't have any metaphysical baggage that we're ascribing to it? In fact, we're actually saying that we're kind of, our methodology, we're necessarily blocked from that unless we try a method that maybe potentially gets us there, right? Like some kind of assessment of knowledge being fallible. It's like maybe we get to that metaphysical baggage, but it's like you're already kind of presupposing that this from the get-go. I think those two, when you compare, that detail needs to be kind of highlighted. Would you agree? Or
Yeah. I think that's a very different approach to how our knowledge is grounded. Yeah.
And I actually can't say that I disagree with any of what you just said. My only thing is that your framework of revelation or of faith, of experience of God as you understand it, all those same points, can have been used to argue for entirely different religions. And so even if we knew that one religion was true, how would we go about showing which it was when the methodology is unreliable? That's my thing. And in contrast to what you call the story, which is grounded in things that we can have a direct experience of, that has predictive power, that has explanatory power that goes beyond just saying, well, God just did it. And while limited or flawed in some ways, has a grounding that, again, it can show the move from imaginary to real in a more successful way, I would say. But I mean, yeah, fair enough. Like, if I don't disagree with how you're framing it, really.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's right. Like, how do we discern who's got the right story? I would think that, and this is why I made this comment earlier. I think that, like, step one is seeing, like, well, I've laid my cards down on the table. I think that people are created in God's image. I think that they're created in a world where his handiwork is shown in everything that's made. But there's a disagreement about that, right? So you don't think that the world is inherently evidence of God. But I would just ask the question, like, what sort of criterion do we have? It sounded like, on the one hand, you want to say that there are things in the world that can be explained naturalistically. I would agree that we have access to natural explanations. But when you say naturalistically, I take that you mean there are explanations that don't require God in any kind of way.
Absolutely.
And that's the kind of thing that I would wonder. Well, how can you identify things in the world as not requiring God unless you have some kind of criteria that distinguishes supernatural from natural explanations? Because it seemed like at the same time you wanted to say that you don't have access to that kind of criteria, that you wouldn't know how to identify something as supernatural. But it seems to me like you need to know what would constitute natural versus supernatural in order to then say, this this computer in front of me doesn't count as evidence of God, or something like that.
So I think there may be ways probably to maybe ground a supernatural explanation. Like, for example, if we were to ask, how do I say this? Can
I comment real quick?
Yeah.
So I would just to like come back around and show, like, I'm not just trying to ask a rhetorical question. It seems to me like here's just one of 1,000 ways to see one reason why I think my worldview is meritorious and where your worldview is failing is here. It looks like I have a criterion to distinguish this world as divine, right? On the one hand, I have this story where human beings are inherently acquainted with God because it's his world. But also there's this historical document that's inspired by him, written by a dozen different authors in lots of different languages over the course of thousands and thousands of years, telling this coherent story to us. The world is made by God. It declares his handiwork. It seems to me like you're without the same kind of criteria. You don't have a criteria by which to distinguish whether or not this or that object out there is natural or supernatural. You're in fact left with a skepticism about your own worldview, that is skeptical whether naturalism can account for.
Right, so I would answer that in a number of different ways. The first is that I don't think you have a criteria. I think you have a set of claims that you happen to believe, and a set of premises that you believe without having the grounds to actually support those premises. Now, I can grant you the observation that when I look at the world, I can't actually know if it's just natural or if God is behind it. Because I agree with you that I don't have access to ontology in that perfect sense with a level of certainty. What I'm trying to say is that, from my perspective, the most intellectually honest and rigorous approach to knowledge and to philosophy is to try to eliminate as many assumptions as we possibly can in the way in which we engage the world. So what I mean by natural is whatever takes place in space and time in the reality that I experience. So I can acknowledge epistemically that maybe there is some other dimension to it. Maybe all these things do depend on God, and I can't, and I don't know that they do. and that's fine. My issue is, do we have good reasons to believe that those things are dependent on God? Or can we do away with that assumption by just looking at what is in front of us, and tackling with the issues with perception, the issues with failed intuition, the issues with our general methodology? How do we move forward given our circumstance? And when I look at the world and I see that most of the world is unfit for life, most species have died out most of the time. Most of what we see is suffering. It seems to me that you have to do more work to say that all this can be explained as we're just fallen, but there's an all-loving, all-powerful God that actually cares about us in some way and wants a relationship with us. It seems you have to do more work to make that seem reasonable, as opposed to, the universe is what it is. We're in the conditions that we're in, and we have to make the best of it given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that maybe I want you to have the final word. We can lead into the moral conversation if you want, but I want you to feel like you're getting.
I just wanted to say real quick. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
That's fine. I think so. I think the issue we're running into right there, just to stay on the epistemological side of things real quick, and we can go into the morality whenever you want. I have all night. So, but just to comment on that. So I think the trouble is, in order to say something like this worldview over here requires more assumptions, or requires more, for lack of a better phrase, explanatory gymnastics or something. It seems to me you need some kind of criterion by which to measure how much of that is going on. But it seems to me also that criterion would just amount to, look, here's this epistemological resource that tells me this counts as supernatural, this counts as natural, and now I can use that to go out in the world and identify which things are natural and supernatural. And look, I've identified all the things so far as just natural. But it seems to me like you're agreeing you don't have such a criterion, which means we don't have any way of saying this or that worldview requires more explanatory gymnastics. We don't even have a way to get off the ground and say that this or that worldview is more consistent with the facts. Now that's real quick. That's not to say that you can't do that as a person. That's to say, I don't think your worldview has the kind of tools necessary to do that. I think from a Christian perspective, right, you can turn right around and say, well, look, God has given his testimony on the subject, right? He's all told us that the world is supernaturally held in the way that it is. Everything that comes to pass is the decree of God, and so is evidence of his handiwork. But if we go into your perspective of things, if we stand from the viewpoint of your story, we really have no way to identify something as having a sufficiently naturalistic perspective, because we don't know if there's a supernatural element that's necessary to it.
Right, but I actually don't see that. Again, part of that depends on how you define supernatural. Because to me, it seems to be a bit of an incoherent concept. I think whatever is the case in reality, even if somehow miracles were possible or people could come back from the dead, my intuition would be that there would be a natural explanation for that if it was possible. So in that sense, I think the scientific method could potentially show that God actually exists, or that the miracles that are talked about could actually potentially happen. Now, if by supernatural you mean beyond nature in the physical sense, then yes, I agree with you that we don't have access to that space. But you're seeing that as a flaw in my worldview, and I'm seeing as sort of being more intellectually honest in that context, where you are making claims about things that we don't have access to, by saying that you have a methodology which grants you access to those things, but that from my perspective are just claims, rather than a method that actually can show these things to be beyond the imagination. So I'm okay with the limitations of science. I'm okay with the limitations of my methodology. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. And I agree with you that science or my worldview on its own, I can't derive from that God doesn't exist, or that reality is necessarily naturalistic, or as opposed to dualistic or idealistic. I accept the fact that I'm removed from that ontology, and I'm okay with that. I think but I don't think that's a problem, because I think everything else is assumed. I think I have to sort of take my losses where there's losses and acknowledge the fact that, this is what all of us, these are limitations of all of us, but religious people don't recognize those limitations. They think that they have more access to knowledge than they actually have, using methodologies which are unreliable. That's my problem.
Yeah, so I think that I'm just contending that your losses here is actually the claim that Christianity is not a necessary condition of things like these inductive surveys that you're doing about people rising from the dead, right? Like, so the belief that your story is a better story than the Christian story is contingent on your conception of what humanity is like and what it means to be rational. Your overall ideal that we were talking about earlier, when you come to the Bible and you say, well, I've got this standard of wisdom, and the Bible just doesn't meet it. It fails to stand up to scrutiny. Okay, that concept of wisdom that you're putting forth, it seems to me like it doesn't have a way of differentiating the Bible as a lesser point of view than yours. It's not, you can't look out into the world and say, this is definitely this definitely has a naturalistic explanation. And it looks like you already want to.
No, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Keep going.
Well, okay. Well, so you have this belief that Christianity is not necessary, and that belief is based off of this belief about how we reason about things and the kind of epistemological situation we're in. But that belief is contingent on having this criteria, which you don't have. And so what I'm pointing out is, well, like, now follow the ladder back up, right? We don't have the criteria, so we have no way of supporting the naturalistic standard that you're taking to the biblical story, which means we have no way of then supporting the belief that there's a way to not be a Christian. Basically, there's a way to not, that we have this contrary point of view that we can take to the universe and interpret things.
So here's why I think that's incorrect, because you may be right in saying that we don't have a way to ultimately say, we don't have a way to disprove Christianity, or any way than we have a way to disprove anything with certainty. That's fine. But we have a way to show that the scientific method has a better track record, has more explanatory power, and the predictive power, because we can simply look at the Bible itself. We can find its contradictions. We can find claims that it made about reality that science showed are incorrect, depending on how you interpret the Bible. If you want to take a more metaphorical approach, then you run into less problems. But it depends on what you mean by what you think I'm suggesting our methodologies can do. I'm not saying that my methodology is going to disprove any particular worldview. What it can do is show that your view doesn't have the grounds to get started in the first place, because the methodology for your worldview is indistinguishable from the imaginary to the real, and from any other religion making claims about revelation and personal experience and personal anecdotes and all those things. Like, I've never tried or even thought of it as meaningful to try to disprove God. I don't need to do that. If you can't provide evidence that's not circular, that's not presupposing you just accepting the book from the start, the burden of proof is not on me to disprove Christianity. It's on people who claim these things are true, showing a methodology which has predictive explanatory power that can show how your ideas and your claims go beyond just imaginary and arbitrary concepts to things that are actual in the world. And we can look at, I mean, I can agree with you that most of us, I mean, you call it sin, right? I might call it, people are imperfect and have destructive drives, and I am a more realist. So, we can, maybe even our views on humanity might not differ that much, even though some of the overall context obviously will be different. I think there's some confusion here as to what it is that, one, what the burden of proof is, and two, what it is that a worldview needs to do to actually have value.
Well, so I think there's some common ground about that, but I guess the way I set up the burden of proof, my conception of our disagreement is you have this idea that humans can be rational, we can follow the enterprise of science, and we can learn things about the world, and none of that depends on relying on a Christian theology. None of that has to do with standing on God's revelation. We don't need a Christian story really to make sense of things like the scientific method or something like that. And then there's my worldview, in which it does, right? Science is an inductive approach to things in the natural order that God himself has set up, using the faculties that God himself has designed. And so, these are two very different takes even on what it means to do science. And so the issue is, that in order to give credence to your view, that would just constitute disproving any view that disagrees about the independence of this world, right? Like if somebody comes along,
I don't agree with that at all, because I'm one, I'm a fallibilist, and two, I'm not making a claim to certainty. I'm saying that we actually have the same worldview in terms of nature being what it is and the faculties being what they are, but you're making one other assumption, which is these things come from God, as opposed to I'm looking at nature, looking at the mechanisms having evolved, and saying, well, maybe they came from God, or maybe they evolved on their own. I can see is the evolution. So I'm only going to talk about the facts that are in front of me.
I understand that's your point of view, right? But what I'm saying is that's just to disagree with the Christian storyline about things, right? The Christian perspective on things is, well, no, they're not just natural. They're quite obviously handiwork of God, right? So you have this point of view that they're not obviously the work of God, and I have this worldview that, well, they're quite obviously the work of God.
Well, that's not my view, though. I didn't quite say that. I didn't say they're obviously not the work of God. So let me rephrase it this way. I don't know if they're the work of God, but all I can look at is what's in front of me. So all we can talk about is the faculties playing out, the nature appearing what it is. And so if it's the case that God put it in motion, I don't have access to that information.
So maybe I think maybe I spoke too quickly and the words got messed up. But what I said was, on your view, it's not obvious. Not obviously not, but not obvious that it's God, right?
Right,
okay.
Right.
So, but that's just to disagree, right? You're just saying the Christian view that says it's obvious is wrong.
Right.
And so to the extent that you're saying that view is wrong, in order to justify your view, whatever reasons you bring to the table will just inevitably be reasons not to take the Christian point of view, right?
But you have the same problem, right? You're in the same position on the other end.
Of course. But I think the difference is you don't have a criterion, you don't have the means necessary to give those kinds of reasons. Whereas if we step into my worldview, yeah, we've got the testimony of God. Like we have all the reason we need. We have maximal reason to think that this is the only way to interpret things, and any other view that comes along where people are saying we can be independent of God just doesn't get off the ground. So I'll
say one last thing. I'll say just one last thing. From my perspective, it's the opposite. What you're saying, you have reasons, from my view, are not reasons. They're just claims that you just circularly have accepted. From my perspective, the reasons that I can provide as to why naturalism is preferable is that it has a track record that speaks for itself, that it makes less assumptions, and that I can leave open-ended whether or not these things ultimately need God as a source, because all I'm looking at and all I can look at are the processes themselves. And so, I'll just leave it at that. And I think that there is a fair sort of contrast between our perspectives, and I'll leave it to whoever's listening to make up their own mind as to what they find convincing.
Okay. Well,
yeah, feel free to say, you can have the last word.
I appreciate that. Okay. Well, I would just say that I think in order to have a track record, you have to have at least one instance of showing, hey, look, here's a naturalistic explanation, and it does a better job than Christianity. But I think what I've argued here, I think successfully, is that you need to first have a criterion that distinguishes what's natural and what's not natural, what's natural and what's supernatural, in order to say, here's an example of something that can be explained naturalistically. And because your worldview doesn't have that criterion, it seems principially cannot have that criterion, you don't actually have the ability to show us one instance of naturalistic explanation. And if there's no one instance, there's no track record. And if there's no track record, there's no ability to say, look, my worldview has a better track record than yours, which from there it follows, look, we have no reason to think this worldview does better than that worldview. And that then, and from there it follows, right? This was my one thing holding up naturalism against Christianity. The reason why I believe you can be a naturalist and not a Christian, the reason why I believe knowledge can be grounded apart from Christianity, was to say that there's this naturalistic worldview that has a track record. So since that's been called off, we're now left with no reason to think that knowledge can be grounded apart from Christianity.
Sorry, I know I said you have the last word.
Go for it. It doesn't bother me.
My OCD is going to drive me crazy.
Go for it.
Yeah. So I would say this. Everybody listening, look at the history of every time that we were told the narrative that X explanation was supernatural, and then see when science actually stepped in and actually explained in detail with far more predictive and explanatory power what this phenomenon actually was. For me, it's the other way around than what you're describing. That I don't need to disprove the supernatural as possible. It may be possible, however you decide to define the term, potentially. But I think the track record is there. I don't think it can be dismissed, because when you look at every time we thought that it was what we saw was best explained by something beyond nature or something moved by God, or et cetera, then people who weren't satisfied with those assumptions developed a method that seems to explain things better to a higher degree of success.
Let me real fast kind of steelman what I think Jimmy might say to that. Or not really steelman, but I've kind of had this conversation with Jimmy, I think, in the past before, is to say that potentially all that's going to be explained by this kind of supernatural primary, right? Like all these things that are going to be natural are going to be caused beyond that. But and maybe that's not what you would say, but I would say, at least before we got into the whole kind of the explanations have been only explained by natural phenomena and nothing else, which I think is a valid point. I say before you even get there, it's not up to the person who's not accepting the claim to accept the criterion of what the supernatural would be. It'd be the person who's presenting the supernatural as an actual candidate explanation needs to actually show what the criterion of the candidate explanation that they're proposing. It's not up to you or anybody else to say that there isn't a leprechaun in my car based on your own criterion, right? It'd be like based off my criterion of the leprechaun in my car that you would have to kind of go. You wouldn't just kind of, because now if I say it's like a midget, right, then we start changing things and it's not really, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's going to have to be dependent upon that person that's making the claim. Otherwise, you are kind of left in a level of arbitrary kind of guessing of the criterion. Because if I just said, well, everything's explained by Schma, right? Or let's say Schmooper Schmappinal. Everything's explained by Schmooper Schmappinal. Well, it's not up to you now, Jimmy, to kind of do away with my explanation of Schmuppenhappel. It's up to me to actually provide the criterion of that, because this is where I go back into my, I can rival your thing with anything. Just rhyme it with, and it be a different metaphysical primary, right? Or even set of a whole new supernatural laws called Schmupperschmappeno laws. And you're not at any point going to have to disprove that. I'm going to have to show why this is a candidate explanation for the reality we live, how we test it in the reality that we live. Otherwise, it's indistinguishable from the just imagination of Schmapper, whatever the hell.
And if you can't back up the premise just to say if X is true, Y is true, is not enough on either side of the conversation. Like, we have to ground our premises in a way that works, and maybe that's the issue too. Is that I think we have difference of opinion as to what that means and what is actually legitimate.
Very much. So I would say that I agree with you that when you set up what you call correctly a candidate for explanation, you need to be able to define that. You need to be able to give it the kind of conceptualization so that we can say, look, because what we expected to follow from that didn't follow, it's false. Or because something followed that shouldn't have, it's false, right? That's very important for an explanatory candidate. What I would say is that the kind of explanations that we're talking about when we talk about God as an explanation is not the kind of thing that you can inductively support or not support with just any observation, because we're talking about the kind of candidate that would explain why something is observable in the first place. So it's I think goes back to something more to do with the philosophy of science than it does to do with actual lab experiments. So I'd say that, but I could give you a couple of criterion that I think it'd be very simple to disprove God if I thought he was disprovable. So one would be you could show that the concept that I have of God involves a logical contradiction, that there are two propositions or two principles about God that are in antinomy. That is, you can't hold to one and also hold to the other. They're mutually exclusive. You could show that the historical narrative of Christianity in its essence involves some kind of core contradiction in the same way that, the Bible says the world is essentially this way, but it's also not essentially this way. I think that would be undercutting to the Christian worldview.
So we'll have to have you back at some point to talk about the history of Christianity and this idea of contradiction, because I think there potentially is an argument for that. I'm not sure that I buy. I'm not sure that I buy it.
I would say, like, so from my perspective, like, right. So I'm gonna, and especially now, more recently, I've through doing a lot of this and more of my philosophical studies, just like you, Jimmy, it's, all on my own. It's right. Like Cease is the only one here is getting a master's, I think, in philosophy, where me and you just like love to do this. And we're just bedroom philosophers, right?
Yeah.
So like for me, I take kind of more of the naturalist approach that I would say I'm not aligned more with the new atheists, right? I'm more going to take the position that the God does not exist. But with Christianity, I'm like it's like the degrees of certainty, right? I'm not going to have Cartesian certainty about the gods that I don't think exist. I clearly going to have a fallibilistic assessment of all knowledge I have, so I could always be wrong. But I've come based off of that kind of criterion that you list. That is why I think that wouldn't be the case. Now, that said, right, I've come to that conclusion. Would you say that I'm now ultimately denying that, and that's going to be a problem in the same ways you've pointed out for Cease? Or would you kind of stay with the point you're saying now, which is that would be a valid way to kind of
in theory, I think that's a valid way.
It's just dependent on what I'm actually dismissing on. Honestly.
Right.
Like I know you're not. It's safe to say you probably wouldn't agree with the reasons that I dismiss it, but you are still going to say that that's a valid way in some kind of epistemology
that's
to get
correct.
to.
Unless you're talking to like some kind of dialetheist, somebody who believes there are true contradictions or something like that, then you might have to be more creative about how you. But even a dialetheist is going to have his own criteria for how Christianity is provable or disprovable. But so those are a couple examples that I just gave. Another example is you could just show some kind of argument that Jesus's body has been found, and he's still very dead. Something like that, where you could disprove historical claims about empirical data.
Sure.
That would count as I think sufficient evidence against Christianity.
It still seems to me that there's just a disagreement here on where the burden of proof lies.
Well, can I?
Well, real fast, Jimmy, before you say, I just want to say I appreciate you offering up some kind of idea of falsification there.
Yeah.
So that is progress. It's a lot of progress.
No, I agree with that.
But yeah,
that.
But to get back to what you guys are kind of going at, I don't want to derail that.
Well, I just wanted to also make like a counterpoint too, that like, okay, I think the issue is that from your standpoint of epistemology, there's no way to falsify that any of the objects we're experiencing are fundamentally supernatural, or that there is some kind of supernatural element to them that makes them what they are. And that is really the key problem, because if we can't do that, we cannot support naturalism whatsoever.
But wouldn't we be using
the
same criteria for naturalism, right? Like, Cease, would you not agree with me that from the ontological level, we will be as probably on the level of Cartesian certainty that it's all natural as on the same level as that we're going to say it's supernatural, right? I mean, there's going to be one's actually demonstrated, right, to actually be a thing. So I can tentatively say I'm going to decide with naturalism as a better explanation. I mean, but the other thing that I don't have really any example of even what it is, right? But at no point am I going to make the Cartesian claim that it can only be naturalism, or that supernatural couldn't be falsified, because of course it can. The method, I would call myself a methodological naturalist. That card for the supernatural is always on the table, but like the problem with it is that, like, I don't even know if it's a card. Like, I don't know if it looks like a card. I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know what I'm even picking up to explain it, because the person who's putting it on the table for me to explain something hasn't really explained to me what the card does, or what it even is. It's just an explanation of Schmalablah.
And that's the irony, is that when you are considering a limitation of my worldview, to me, it's just an awareness of where all of our epistemic limitations lie. And so I don't see it as the problem that you're claiming it is. But what you said about one way to falsify your perspective, I guess where my concern would be is sort of the language games that arise when you try to point out to Christians where these contradictions lie. That to me is something that I've run into a lot. Like, because I feel like I have to refresh my memory and we can have you back, but I feel like every time that I brought an example of a contradiction to a Christian, they've always sort of, they sneak their way out of, they start playing language games where now words don't mean anything anymore and anything goes. And that's my frustration with that.
I think sorry, go ahead.
So this is a good comment, and I guess what we've been trying to point out to you is the naturalist notices patterns between the things out there, regardless of their fundamental ontology. So we're up. We can remain a methodological naturalist without being necessarily a metaphysical, naturalist that just says nature is all there is, like Mike said about the card example.
Yeah. I'm not going to throw someone hands me the card and just go, don't need that to explain anything in my worldview, because I might need to hold on to that card. I think it would be, and this is where the intellectually honest part that Cease was saying earlier, where he was like, you kind of see it as a flaw, and maybe you don't. Maybe we're doing a bad job of representing what you're saying there. But what he was saying is kind of like, where you see it as a potential flaw, I see it as me trying to be intellectually honest and consistent. And I would agree in that same sense of that, like, if I'm going to at least just be consistent about from the get-go. I had this conversation for the last 2 days with the Bond man, right, on your Discord. Was kind of like, at no point am I making any claim of certainty to the ontological baggage.
Yeah.
At any point there, I think it would be foolish for me to do, right?
Would you like to get to the moral part of the question?
Yeah, sorry guys, I didn't mean to
Yeah.
No, you're
Yeah.
good. I'm just realizing the time. So I don't know how much time everybody has.
It's up to you. Yeah, it's up to you guys. We could do it then. We could cut it. We could do it for another show. We could. It's up to you guys. We got 14 viewers, so we got.
I'm good
people
with going into it.
Yeah, it's up to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, well, it's funny to me because earlier you mentioned that you thought, Christianity has a harder time explaining what essentially comes down to something like the problem of evil. That there's a lot of suffering in the world. We're surrounded by what I called futility and mayhem earlier. And it seems to me that's quite the opposite. That in Christianity there is this good God. He's inherently beautiful. He's inherently worthy. He's triune. And so this God exists and eternally experiences love in and of himself. And that God creates the world and fills it with creatures so that he can share that love with these creatures. He can share his glory and his beauty with these creatures. And the biblical story of Genesis tells of God making things in a certain order so that he can then step down into that world and walk among his creatures and commune with them. So that's really like the moral idea of Christianity, is that human beings are made to experience joy. It's to some degree a hedonistic worldview, because we are designed to know joy, to know the ultimate kind of pleasure. But the issue is that human beings, we're also in covenant with God, and that comes with certain obligations. So, Adam and Eve were supposed to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they disobeyed. They sinned, and that because they're in covenant with God, because they are sort of the mediators for the state of the world. They're representatives of the cosmos who are supposed to be ordering it, and they disobeyed God. That threw the cosmos into chaos. The representatives of the cosmos turned the cosmos into chaos, and that's what we witness all around us. But Christianity, besides explaining good and evil in that way, also has a resolution to the problem. God is gracious. Although we deserve justice, although we don't deserve his mercy, God steps back into the world, takes on humanity to himself, and he lives the perfect life that nobody can live, so that sinners like us who disobey God every day can experience his grace, can be reunited with him through Christ dying on the cross. He has paid for our sins, and he offers us eternal life with God. So we have this story where good and evil have meaning. They refer to something out in the world, and where human beings have a hope that we can live by. Right? I have a reason to live and to do what I do every day I get up, because I'm looking forward to the fact that, hey, I'm going to have ultimate pleasure. I'm going to have ultimate joy one day, living with God, and I experience tastes of that every day in my everyday life. But it seems to me like, by contrast, if you take God out of the picture, now the question becomes, well, I mean, what even is good and evil? When we look out into the world and we point at evil, it seems very obvious that there's evil there, but that seems to be a problem for non-Christian worldviews, because they don't have a very good explanatory.
Could I point something out just real fast that you said? I want some clarification on.
Yeah, go for it.
Jump in. You said that you look forward to like the maximal, like, or the pleasure that you'd get from that, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't that necessarily, that the where you're deriving that from is derivative off your well-being, right? Like, if you're going to say the statements that these things that you want to do in the future, like be with God, or we've had conversations about hell, avoid hell is something we've both agreed to, if that exists, that we both were on we want to avoid that, right? But doesn't that seem to be from that level of well-being is going to be the precondition for that, and has nothing to do with the God, but it has to do more so with your eternal well-being, or your internal, well-being?
I guess I don't think so, because I think that well-being from a Christian point of view, health, really has to do with the Christian idea of life. And from a Christian perspective, to experience eternal life always involves life with God. To be apart from God is really to experience a level of death. And in fact, that's why the Bible talks about life and death in terms of God's presence. So like I'm sorry to be long-winded, but the biblical book of Leviticus is very mysterious to some of its readers. But the key concept there is that God has come down to be with his people, to share his life-giving presence with people, and that involves both the joy of God's presence and the health that Christians experience in God's presence. But in order to do that, there's all these laws of purity so that Christians can be in God's presence, so that saints can experience God's presence, because God can't tolerate impurity in his presence. He's too beautiful, he's too holy. It would be unjust for him to sit there and put up with it. So this book is very weird to a modern reader. There's all these weird rules, but the basic idea there, I think, is what you're talking about, that God is after what we might call the well-being of people. He's in the business of giving people who don't deserve it life. And the Christian view of life is life with God, that you really need to be in God's presence to experience the ultimate state of health.
Yeah, and that would all be based off of sorry, Steve, to cut you off here, but that would be all based upon your internal well-being, everything about your neurophysiology of how you feel would be the case, not because that's going to be necessarily dependent upon how you feel, not these external factors, right? I don't see how you leak that into it. It seems to.
No, I think it's saying. I think it's saying that it's God is providing the framework for what he's describing as well-being. Like the well-being in this context is to be with God, to be in the grace of God, and to have eternal life.
That's right.
But what you I think are failing to realize here, and what I think is ironic from my perspective, is that you're only changing the details or the strategy to arrive at well-being. The phenomenological experience of well-being is the same. Only you are thinking that the context in which you can experience that is through God, is through eternal life, is through these things that your worldview says will lead you to this experience. As opposed to, this is why I completely reject the idea that without God, this thing ceases to make sense. Because we're both talking about the nature of consciousness and phenomenology. I don't need to assume anything supernatural about the difference between suffering and well-being and the behaviors that will lead to one or the other. And this is where I think, and again, I think maybe that part of the conversation is for another time, but we're talking about inconsistencies with the concept of God. I don't see a perfect being creating an imperfect creation, an all-loving being creating the circumstances for hell. From my perspective, Christianity is immoral because it creates a framework of tyranny where we are answering to a God with intellect, and the consequences are inescapable and eternal. And for people who are, I don't choose what I find convincing, right? Like I don't choose, I'm not rejecting God because I want to be sinful. Especially when in the context of Christianity, I can be sinful and try to my best to do what God wants me to do, but I'm still going to sin. But ultimately, if I repent, I'll be saved. That seems like an approach that someone would take if they could believe. But how would I say this? The only ground necessary is that consciousness is a thing that we can point to, and that it has a certain nature. So why is it that when it comes to naturalism, you want to play this game where well-being can't really be defined anymore, and it's all a matter of all up for grabs, but then in the context of God, it's this clear, concrete thing when the experience is the same?
I guess I wouldn't agree that. I guess I wouldn't. I think that's just assuming your point of view to say that there's this experience of well-being. I happen to think God provides for that, and you don't. I would say that I think, from my perspective, people experience God's goodness. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. God has a common grace that he shares with everybody, and to that extent, everybody. There are people who are not Christians, but they have a roof over their heads, they have food to eat. from the standpoint of Christian law, the idea of moral law, everybody deserves death. So really every breath that we're taking, every day that we're waking up and not diseased, every time we go to work, we're not hit by a car, that's all God's grace. God is giving to that. God is giving that to us mercifully. And so I guess I would just disagree that I don't think, I think the very objection that I'm raising is, what would well-being even be if we're not describing something in the context of a relationship with God? What are we describing other than enjoyment of God's good gifts?
It would be the phenomenological experience of fulfillment that I think all of us can point to without having to make that assumption. Like, it's not just because God might not exist, suddenly the meaning that I get from following in my passions, creating relationships with my family, having friends, all disappears because God doesn't exist. So
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I guess that just is my challenge, right? So, like, if you're saying you have a sense of fulfillment by loving your family, from my perspective, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that's not meaningful. I think it is meaningful, but the disagreement is on whether God's essential to that, right? So the issue I have is, let's take God out of the picture for a moment. What are we really describing when we say a person is fulfilled by doing certain things for his family? Like, let's say that you provide financially so that people in your family can continue to live. They have food, they have shelter. Let's say you're doing something like that. Why is that why is that meaningful? Why is that fulfillment not just a matter of personal preference?
Because the nature of consciousness is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of, it's like saying, why are the laws of physics what they are? Like, that, why it's what it is may be unanswerable. But the fact that it is the case, we can examine. And it's not like, you can look at psychological studies, you can look at neuroscience, you can look at phenomenology. If it was a matter of pure opinion or just preference, then all of us could behave entirely differently and arrive at the same state. And in that case, we would have no grounds to talk about morality. What I'm suggesting is that the evidence points to the opposite being the case, where it's not a matter of culture or opinion, it's a matter of phenomenology, which is basically the nature of consciousness. Like, if I put this is a kind of a very reductive example, but if I put my hand on a hot stove, I don't choose, like, it's not a matter of opinion whether or not that is going to result in pain, right? Now, okay, there are people with pain disorders, and we can talk about sort of there are outliers, but that I don't think undermine the whole issue here. But I don't choose the fact that situation is going to lead to a certain kind of experience. The same way that any moral behavior, from my worldview, results in certain experiences that we cannot decide. This is why you look at people who often abuse others. They are often the product of abuse. These aren't happy, fulfilled people whose life choice is just to go and rape and kill people because that's what leads them to happiness. Like, these are those kind of, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand. So, but I think there's a problem here, and that is that it sounds like what you're describing is really indistinguishable from a statistical average of personal preferences. So it seems like you're describing a situation in which society happens to share preferences. Like, our society doesn't like rape. There have been many societies that did like rape throughout history. They treat women like garbage. Look at the Middle East. Look at Africa. Still living like women are garbage. That has been the popular trait of societies going back into the past. It's a rather modern culture, I think, that comes from Christian ethics, that women are not treated like garbage. We can talk about the history of that later, but wherever you think that comes from, like, it's the norm historically that societies treat women like garbage. We happen to live in a society that doesn't. And you're saying, well, we can see that that's abuse. Well, what that really means is that these what you're calling outliers. I don't think it's an outlier. It's just a different statistic. One is a statistic of many societies throughout history. Yours is a statistic of America and some other first world countries share different values, share different preferences. And the question is, well, why should we think of that? Why should we agree with the American value that this is abuse, rather than agreeing with, like, say, the Assyrian value that women are just property and they can be treated however we want?
So maybe I feel like you've misunderstood my perspective, because the entire point is that it's not cultural. It has nothing to do with culture or social norms. It's that there is something deeper there, that we can look at human nature regardless of culture. Yes, cultures may have different opinions as to what will lead to well-being, and they can be wrong. And we can show through the scientific method and through looking at phenomenology and consciousness as nature, like not culture, not society, but nature, and to see why it is that certain cultures, in contrast to other cultures, will produce higher levels of suffering when making that comparison. So it's not to do with American versus the Middle East in the sense of it coming from cultural values. It's observing and examining what it is that we mean by phenomenological experiences. Like when we use the word bad or we use the word good, what are we referring to? And I'm saying that we are referring to particular states of being that we can examine, that isn't arbitrary, isn't cultural, and that these words actually mean something, that the language are descriptors. They're not like, it's not going to be my definition of bad versus their definition of bad. There's such a thing as bad, and we may have different strategies as to what we think will lead us there as opposed to something else, but the states are the states, and they are naturally the case, not culturally.
Well, insofar as you're talking about phenomenological experiences and biology, that doesn't seem to point to any universal, like, good or evil. It really.
I disagree entirely. I think it absolutely does.
Well, I would just argue that it sounds like what you're doing is just changing the ground of the statistics. So now we're not talking about statistics about society. We're just talking about statistics of individual apes. There are collections of apes, some of which share preferences for some things, some of which share preferences for other things. But I mean, the issue just is, why should we care about the preferences of apes? I mean, they're just a species of animal. They each one of them has their own personal preferences. Each one of them finds fulfillment in different things. But why should their preferences matter for questions of how we should act?
Because that is what. So a few things here. The first is that it's not just a matter of arbitrary preference. It's a matter, like I said, it's a matter of actual nature, and it's not just humans. Like I would actually extend this moral framework to any creature that can experience suffering and well-being. Now, if you want to say why should we care? But that to me is like saying, again, it's trying to find a metaphysical justification that sort of makes a linguistic error. It's like saying, does it make sense to say, is holding my hand in the fire till it burns off bad? Why should I care that it hurts?
Why is that bad?
So it's what I'm saying is that it's the descriptor of bad is referring to the experience itself, that it is intrinsically the case, that what it means to be a person that can experience is going to have, by its nature, what that looks like, going to call that thing bad because of the character of that experience in light of other experiences that then we call good. It's not arbitrary. So language is secondary in that context. It's not.
I agree that. Well, I'm not. I agree with you. I'm not challenging you that language is secondary. But what I would say is that it sounds like what you're saying is when the person, when the human puts another human's hand in the fire, one person is experiencing sadistic pleasure, and another person is experiencing agony because their hand is in the fire, and you're identifying the agony as bad. And the issue is, well, why is agony bad? Who says that agony is bad? What's wrong with the pleasure of the sadist?
So, several things to that. One is obviously the so-called pleasure of the sadist is not the same kind of experience of fulfillment that we're talking about when we mean well-being. Usually, sadists are really reacting on impulses that they are often the slave to. These are not happy people fulfilled. So when we're comparing, it's like saying, how do I say this? For the same reason, here's how I'll frame it. For the same reason that you would call being with God better than not being with God. It's the same kind of concept, is that intrinsically, by the nature of the character of the experience, we can say that one is better than the other. I'm not applying the same thing, just I'm using consciousness as a natural process.
Yeah, but it seems to me that there's a very big difference there, that in the case where God has created human beings, he's then in a position to design them in such a way that when he says it's good for you not to cause other people's needless pain, that's actually true. He's in a position to tell us that, and he can't be wrong about it because he's the one who's designed human nature to be that way, right? But in your case, there are just organisms by accident have evolved to have certain common traits. One of their uncommon traits is that some of those apes like causing other people displeasure. Some of those apes don't. Both of them are just following organic impulses. Both of them are slaves to their ape impulses. The only difference is they have different preferences.
But that's not quite right, because it's not the case that the person who wants to do pain, like you're using God as, oh, we can't be wrong because God designed it. But I'm saying we've evolved. Nature is what it is. We don't choose nature, and it's not arbitrary. Nature is what it is. And it is the case that if you harm somebody, you are also hurting yourself. You can say that you are experiencing sadistic pleasure, but that is not the height of well-being I'm referring to. Mm-hmm. If you look at Buddhist philosophy, if you look at studies on neuroscience and psychology in the context of serial killers, abusers, people who enact pain on other people, the assumption that there are just alternatives, ways of living, you don't have a leg to stand on scientifically, because all the data shows otherwise. I was never talking about statistics. I'm talking about principles of nature here. And again, I'll send you the studies. Like I'll send you the why it is I've arrived at this position. But nature even could be what it is without potentially being designed. It could just happen to be the case that nature functions as it does. The states are what they are. And then we derive a language to describe those states. And those are things that we call good and evil. And that's why they're not arbitrary. And yeah, I just reject that somebody, it's going to do harm.
Let me ask a question to Jimmy about this. Would it be, especially if we're taking a comparison of people whose neurophysiology or in some way that their makeup is not to what the standard of what we've observed a normal brain functioning to be, right? Would that have any kind of indication of why the behavior is such the way versus, I mean, like, wouldn't those clearly wouldn't be the people we're talking about, right? We're not talking about the people who have an objectively different makeup that is not, the process.
What I would say is we have no norm to measure what people should be in a naturalist framework, except groups of apes. So the issue is, why are we choosing one group of apes over another? I mean, if we look at the history of human civilization, it's a very cruel, dastardly, rapey history. Humans are disgusting creatures in their history. Most civilizations have been tyrannical. They've industrialized killing people.
Sure, but you would agree that those actions based off of like some ad populum isn't what makes up the objective claim of what is.
But that's all we have access to.
But the norm is the same as yours. The norm is well-being. The only difference is that you think it was designed, and I think it came, and I think it exists through natural means. The well-being is the same. It's not. The norm is there, and I feel like I provided that foundation.
Yeah, I would just say that I don't think you have. I think the issue is you keep smuggling in this value language, like good and bad, well-being. But when we look at what those words actually mean, what they reduce to in their meaning, when we cash out what we're referring to, we're just referring to statistics about either biological impulses, preferences that are determined by neurology, certain behavioral patterns of apes. But again, like if we go back to Assyria, the behavioral patterns of apes was to treat women like trash. In that period, we would all look to each other and say, "But this is for the good of."
But those behaviors, but it's irrelevant for people. It's like saying, before we knew the dangers of smoking, people thought that smoking wasn't unhealthy. That doesn't change the objective fact that smoking leads to health problems.
For those who smoke, right?
What's that?
Well, for the people who are smoking and for anyone who's breathing the smoke. But like if America, let's say a smaller state, let's say that let's say like Hawaii was the only place where people were not smoking themselves to death. Would the human race survive? Yeah, would do just fine. The fact that some people are smoking doesn't mean that everyone has to smoke. And so when the issue is you're conflating the survival of the species with the survival of a lot of individuals.
No, because survival is only one component. The phenomenology of experience and the character of experience is quite different than this. I mean, yes, there are certain behaviors that we can say are moral because they hold, they help us towards the goal of survival. But I'm actually referring to something else. The quality of life, as opposed to the quantity of how many years you exist in the world. So you keep saying, we're only reverting back to apes.
Yeah.
But that's a strange.
I mean, that's all we are on naturalism. We're just.
I fail to see the problem. I mean, I'll say it again. My moral framework applies to not just apes, but anything that can experience. Anything that can experience suffering and well-being. So it's not just about human beings.
Well, I mean, lions experience suffering and your concept of well-being, presumably, but they rape and kill each other all the time. So I don't see, or take gorillas, or take any kind of life form that's out there killing its kind, doing all kinds of cannibalism, what you would consider rape. Like, they survive perfectly well, my friend. They're doing just fine. Their species is actually propagated by that kind of behavior. So I don't see why this really has nothing to do with, like, we're trying to say something like, to me, if you ask me, well, we're trying to say something like rape is bad. It's universally bad. It's always bad. There is no exception to the rule. That I would agree with. But you just don't get that by looking at biology. Looking at behavioral patterns of apes doesn't entail in any way, shape, or form that rape is bad. But
I disagree.
I would disagree. So real fast, like the idea that we speak of when we talk about these value judgments, right? When we kind of take in these normative claims, you don't have any value, like, at all. This is why the odds don't seem to be your big issue when you recognize the fact that value only comes from life itself. And so it seems weird to me that you wouldn't apply these kind of what you would ought to do, right? Like, it seems like you're going to have to live off of what you are to do to maximize that. Now, you can disagree with the foundation of that, and that's fine. But the problem is with disagreeing with that is that you're disagreeing with the foundation that the only thing that serves as a foundation for you to even have the value. I mean, without the life, without the well-being of that, then where's the value to be had? Where do you even argue from the normative judgments that you make, right?
But Mike, see, that seems to me consistent with my worldview, right? On my worldview, humans are designed to desire pleasure, to desire survival, to desire all these things. They live in a way that is, in varying degrees of consistency, line up with those values. And on top of that, not only do they have this internal motivation or drive, but those actually are values because that's how God creates the world to be, to involve this moral law, right? So there's a moral law. There's subjects of that moral law that have drives to follow it to varying degrees. So that's consistent with my worldview. But if we step back into naturalism, there's no moral law.
I would say that it's only consistent with your worldview if it's subject to the mind which is the arbiter of it. If it was my mind or another mind to be the arbiter of what would be those values, then we're just pointing out that your foundation is inherently subjective.
But
That's my problem with that, is that you're comparing it to a worldview which is inherently subjective based on the mind of it, and not in any way an objective fact about analyzing the world. It is just simply this is the case because of my mind. That isn't an objective standard. That is inherently subjective.
But that's the issue, right? Is that I think Cease wants to say moral realism is the case, not moral subjectivism. There really are.
Oh yeah, we're both moral realists. Yeah,
but the value doesn't dissolve just because you say it's not designed. The value remains by the mere fact that it is the case that even if those drives weren't designed, those drives still exist. And when you're talking about lions, for example, like we can still say from our we can still say that it would be a better world if animals didn't do those things. But when we're talking about moral agents, we're talking about people that, we have the capacity to do otherwise. We have the capacity to reflect on what these things are. A lion might not. So now, some more realists might want to say that, well, the lion is still immoral for doing so, for there being rape in the animal kingdom, and I would probably agree with that. I don't think to just say, well, we're just physical things means that value all of a sudden is an illusion. No, value arises from the fact that we have consciousness and can reflect on the nature of our experience of reality.
That's just to identify value as the individual drives and preferences of those things with consciousness. And insofar as we've done that, that's just subjectivism. That's just to say that the individual's preferences are the only referent of the word moral value. And what I've argued here is that, look, that's the problem with consciousness, and the distinction you find on my worldview is not only are people naturally inbuilt with these drives to reflect on what they do and to make value judgments about them, but there actually exists a transcendent moral law by which to make those judgments, and therefore to make them factual judgments and not just judgments about biological and sociological statistics.
No, because for it, again, if you think that I'm talking about a subjective preference, then you've missed the point, because it has nothing to do with preferences. It has to do with the reality of consciousness. So it's grounded in nature. It's not.
Yeah. Can you define that? Like maybe part of it is we're not.
Well, he's lumping in imposition of other things' well-being, right? So like that would be inherently not subjective to that. That would extend to the things outside of it, right? It would.
But we're trying to define well-being, though, right? Like what is well-being to you? If you're saying well-being has to do with consciousness, what does it have to do with consciousness?
Yeah, I think I said axioms. I was looking at something at the YouTube name. I'm sorry. I think Cease kind of had mentioned that at the beginning, right? Of what he meant by well-being.
Yeah, to a large degree, it would probably be, I would say, a combination of. By the way, let me just say one thing. I'm okay with the idea of the concept of well-being being open, and us figuring out what strategies will lead to it. Like, I'm not saying that I have the perfect answer, but what I'm saying is we know enough to make certain kind of claims. Like, we know enough to say certain behaviors lead to certain psychological states of being, and then we can attribute certain physiological components as well, like what it means to have the stress of PTSD from war or from a rape or from abuse. Like, we can point to these things that, we don't need a philosophy degree to say that there are certain experiences that are very different in their character. And when we talk about fulfillment, when we talk about loving another person, when we're talking about friendship, these are things that we experience and can point to the same way. And again, it's the same kind of well-being that you might want to attribute to the idea that you might be with God for eternity. The concept of fulfillment, of love, of being at home or being where you belong.
Yeah.
It just that for some reason, when it gets to naturalism, you think that nature ceases to be. It just all becomes cultural or arbitrary. And I'm saying, no, apply the same notion of well-being just recognize that it can be retained without having to be designed. If you can recognize the nature of well-being as God once made it, you should be able to recognize the same principle.
You think we're missing the key distinction here. So the issue is you're looking at both of us are looking at certain psychological states. I think both of us are looking at more than psychological states, but we're looking at certain psychological states, and we identify some of them as good and some of them as bad. But the difference is that when I do so, I have a justification for saying this one is good and this one is bad, and that justification is in the moral law that God has laid down. It's not merely a preference that I have.
It's not merely a preference for me either.
But what's the justification?
Well, hold on. I'm sorry, real fast, because it seems that we're going to talk past each other, and I know I'm more on C's side, but you're claiming for the justification on his side, right? But he's presented things within actual sciences, which I know you're going to disagree, can't answer these kind of normative claims. Like I get that, right? But I don't see on your side the justification other than just an assertion. So like when you make these kind of claims that he hasn't defined these things, like I could just say Vishnu is what provides me my moral grounding, and I have done everything that you've done to offer up, right? Like, because it's just a claim from that standpoint. So like, I don't mind him going on that, but I would like, since we're at almost the 2-hour mark, if we can, like, how do you justify it? Like, if he's going to justify that, how do you justify it beyond just saying the Bible? Because then at that point, like, if he adopted your epistemology to get there, like, you would clearly reject that if he applied the same principles. And that's the one thing I would want to point out or highlight.
But not on a methodological ground, right? Like the reason I would reject Hinduism the same way that I reject naturalism, which isn't to say that I would object to a person thinking that Vishnu is necessary for morality. I would object to the idea that Vishnu can account for morality, right? That Hinduism has a coherent.
Sure, and under mine, I would just say Christianity can't for other reasons. But I mean,
sure.
Cease, if you want to go ahead and I guess give what justification
actually
would be, so that way I'm not completely cutting you off. But I just feel like it'd be fair to also get that on the other end to kind of see, because it just seems to be a blanket statement that he could just use. He could use your exact kind of premises, and I think you would reject them, and rightfully so, right?
I think you're trying to point to the is-all problem. Like you're trying to claim that I can't derive value from the state of being of affairs. I'm saying that is a linguistic error.
How so?
Because we're always in the value business. When value is just another word for, in this context, for where we've arrived at to being able to tell the difference between one phenomenological experience and the other. I can say the same thing to you. Like ultimately, why should we care about being with God? If you want to say well-being is being with God, I can say the same. I can play the same kind of game. Right? I can say, well, why should that matter? If you're looking for some kind of metaphysical justification outside of the experience itself, you're not going to find it. Doesn't matter if it's designed or not. Like if you want to say, well, God is the center of goodness, why should I care about goodness?
Yeah,
same thing.
Yeah, so I disagree with you, and I think there's an important distinction to make here. So we can distinguish between motivational reasons. So those are things like our emotional drives to care about things, and we can distinguish between moral reasons, which is something like a fact of the matter that justifies a certain moral judgment or belief that something is right or wrong. So if you're asking the question, why should we believe? Why are we rationally obligated to believe that rape is wrong? It seems to me that on your worldview, there's no answer. There's just, well, some people prefer not to rape. Some people prefer to think that rape is wrong, and other people prefer to disagree. On my worldview, there's an objective fact of the matter. God has made it a law in the universe that rape is wrong, and people should not do that. You can ask the other question real quick. You can ask the other question, right? Why be emotionally driven to do that? Well, I would say two things. Number one, I think a lot of people are not emotionally driven to respect that law. I think people are emotionally driven to respect morality generally to different degrees, But overall, I think that's kind of the problem, is that humanity is sinful. We are generally emotionally disrespectful to about God's law. And that's exactly why we need to be saved from our condition. We've been set apart from God. We need to be reunited to him. We need to be made like him so that we can really enjoy life. And from that perspective, right, it makes sense to say pleasure and moral living are connected, because the God in whose presence we're supposed to originally enjoy, we would be totally moral. We would be totally moral, and that's why we would be in his presence. But on naturalism, there just is no reason to think that pleasure and what a given ape thinks is moral line up. I mean, one person thinks that it's totally pleasurable to be a sadist. The Assyrians thought it was totally pleasurable to go out and genocidally wage war against other peoples. They considered that the height of imperial awesomeness. And other people disagree. And, there's no objective fact that decides who's right or wrong.
But that's not the objective fact has been presented to you, and for some reason it's not registering, because it has nothing to do with preference. It's not the case that some people think rape is bad, some people think rape is good, and there's no way to show who's right and who's wrong. No, the objective facts are facts that we can observe about nature. It's not a matter of preference. It's a matter of facts about experience and the consequences of those experiences that we can point to and show that it's irrelevant if one culture thinks that one strategy will lead to well-being or not, because we can show how that.
Okay, let me help real fast. You would think that that Jimmy, you would agree that people having a preference on the Hindu god doesn't have any indication that the Hindu god is the right god based on
by itself. By itself, that wouldn't
right. Yeah. So how in this logic can you apply that to what Cease is saying?
I'm not sure I follow that question.
You're saying if it's a preference to rape or a preference to do these other things, that there's now this issue because people disagree. Well, people disagree with what god it is that you're going.
People disagree about physics,
right? So I don't see how. That's not a problem for the God thing, but it's a problem for us in the morality.
Yes, because all we have to refer to is the neurological or conscious states of the people. And so if those conscious states are in disagreement, there's no.
But the thing is but that's the point, is that they're not. The experience of somebody that does harm is a negative one. They might do it because they're reacting to certain drives. But those people are not happy, fulfilled people. That's the thing that we can show objectively that's the case. Okay. And let me just add,
go ahead,
because I don't want to forget.
Yeah.
It's the irony from my perspective is that in your worldview, morality is subjective, because it's subjective to God's whims. It's subjective to what God arbitrarily decides is the case. From my worldview, it's not subjective because it's not a matter of preferences. It's a matter of facts that we can observe about nature. And you seem to when I ignore that and say, well, a person can rape and feel well-being, and a person can help another person and feel well-being, therefore it's all arbitrary. Like, people are going to do opposite things and feel the same experience. I'm saying that is not the narrative that's being provided to you. That's not the case. All the evidence in psychology and neuroscience and phenomenology shows that it's not the case that a rapist can rape and feel and be happy. Like, that's not the reality of the situation. So the objective justification is nature itself, and there are people who disagree about physics, right? There are people who don't believe in evolution. There are people who like, if you get someone that says, I don't believe in gravity, who gives a shit? Like, it's the same thing. It's like, to me, it's equivalent to, well, I don't believe that that we should be moral to people. It's like, nature is what it is, regardless of people's opinions.
Well, I agree with you that there's a natural order to correct people who disbelieve that things are going to fall back to the earth. But the issue is in this naturalistic worldview where you appeal to consciousness or psychology. I'm not sure. Insofar as that's all we can do to explain what we're talking about, there just is no way to distinguish that from personal preferences. But if you're referring to something that you think is objective, then what is the psychological state that entails the belief rape is wrong? What is that psychological state that we're talking about?
Well, again, so we're about to, we just hit the 12-hour mark, so we should probably close it soon, but I do want to answer your question. It's one, the recognition of what it is like, so the qualia of what it is like to experience suffering as opposed to well-being.
But what is that? I mean, what is that quality that entails the belief that rape is wrong?
The very nature of the experience of the suffering that results from an experience like that. So by wrong, what could I mean? Well, wrong is a descriptor of that type of suffering. And so from my perspective, this is-all distinction is an illusion. Science is always interested in values. It values, logic in that sense. Like there's not this distinction that some people want to say there is. And yes, all we have is the consciousness, the neurology, the experiences, but that's all we need. We don't need some other justification. We can look at, again, this is why I said, and I've said to use this before, language is secondary. So we have phenomena, we have certain experiences, and we naturally we are driven to say that certain things are bad and certain things are good by the nature of that experience. Going back to, is putting my hand on the fire till it falls off bad? Yes. The only context in which bad could make sense is in that kind of experience.
Yeah, so I would just have to say that this view is really, it's just a subjectivism. When you say there's this experience, either that could mean there's this experience which I prefer not to experience or which I prefer to experience, and then you can project that on society as a standard of right and wrong. Or maybe you mean something like there's this mystical property of my personal experience that tells me it's wrong, but then somebody else can come along and say there's this mystical property of my experience that allows me to disagree with you and say that's the right way to live. I mean, the Assyrians could take up that's it. But this really, I mean, is very straightforward subjectivism. There's nothing universal or extramental about it, and so
it's universal. I disagree. It's universal because it's grounded in nature, not opinion.
But your experience isn't nature. Your experience is just your personal experience.
Of course, my experience is nature. My experience, the phenomenology of my consciousness and the experiences that I have is entirely grounded in nature. Like we have no reason to think that it's here.
Like we can grant for the sake of argument that it might be produced by nature, but that doesn't mean that the experience itself is my object of experience, right? You and I have different experiences. Everyone has different experiences. And the issue is, why should cease to know's experiences dictate to us what's morality? Because
when you look at the what it is to be a conscious creature in detail, and you look at the studies that have been done, looking at this, what I'm calling nature, we actually find that it's not, first of all, there's a confusion here between subjective and relative. Relative is kind of like anything goes. Subjective is, you and I can look at a table, and you experience that subjectively, and I'm experiencing that subjectively, but we're actually talking about something objective there. So the fact that, so there's that distinction there. Yeah. But what I'm rejecting is this notion that the nature of your experience is going to be entirely different than the nature of my experience. And I reject that because when you look at, again, the science of it, and you might just want to reject the science from the start, but I don't. We actually find commonalities. We don't see this. You would have a point if somebody could rape another person and feel the type of phenomenological experience that I'm saying is moral when we talk about altruism and helping other people. But that's not what we see. And again, I can send you the studies, whether it's in psychology and neuroscience. I can send you what grounds this objectively, what grounds this in nature, what connects my experience to your experience, to Mike's experience, to everybody else's experience. It's not what you think it is.
Yeah, so I would just say that I would say two things. First of all, I would say that this is really, I think, just to confuse subjectivism and realism. Insofar as you say there are psychological studies about consciousness, those are just studies of an individual's personal stream of consciousness. It's not going to be the study of extramental objects. The extramental object is just that person's experiences.
It's the studies showing a collective what it is for.
A statistic of society, yeah. It would just be a statistic about the average of experiences of a certain.
It's more. No, it's not even about average or statistic in that sense. It's far more than that. Maybe what I will do is I will provide you with this evidence because and what these studies actually are pointing to, because you I think in your mind retain this idea that in my worldview you can rape and be okay, and just because we can have studies that show that that's not the case for some people, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be the case for others.
No, it would just. What I would say is that to the person you say rape is wrong, from the perspective of a naturalist worldview, what when you say what you're doing is wrong, what that sentence really means is I don't like that, or it really means this is a abnormal behavior. So what? Those are not moral statements.
No, the sentence actually means and entails that if you do X, you will experience Y.
Okay.
And so in that context, what we mean by bad or immoral is the Y. Or on the other side, by moral.
But there's nothing about Y that entails the belief Y is good or Y is bad. It's just, if you do this, you'll experience Y. And then the other person turns around and looks at you and says, well, I think Y is good. And my personal experience tells me Y is good. So why should I take all you have is your personal experience. There's no objective standard of whether Y is good or bad. So
I think there is to some degree, for some reason, we're talking past each other. What you're describing my position to be is something else entirely as to what I've described. And maybe we can have round two at some point.
Okay, sure.
But again,
I don't mean to keep the stream going on too long. So
no, it's fine. With the studies I'm referring to show that there's a notion of collective well-being that's a hint. It's not what you're saying. It's not a matter of my experience is one and their experience is going to be another. That is not the science is pointing to a collective of phenomena, not this subjective, arbitrary matter of opinion or culture that's going to shift. That's not the reality that I'm describing here. And if you want to ask why is rape, in the context of those experiences, why is that bad? It's to misunderstand the role of language. We are describing phenomena, and it would be the equivalent to saying, well, if you're saying that the state of being with God is good and the state of being apart from God is bad, why is that bad? Why is that good? You saying it's design is irrelevant because we're both dealing with an is. And you're trying to say that I need to justify an ought that's apart from the is, when you can't do that for your own worldview.
Let me contest that real quick, right? So I agree that from in a naturalist universe, the ought doesn't, nothing about Y being bad follows from the phenomenological nature of Y. There just is no kind of fact about that would entail belief that Y is bad. But it does follow from the statement that God has designed human beings such that rape is bad. If I say God has designed human beings such that rape is bad, the belief that rape is bad does follow from that description, right? That's the difference.
They're both, because they're both claims about what is. And you seem to think that in your worldview, you can derive an ought from the is, and from my worldview, I can't. I'm saying that because nature is not subjective in the way you're describing, or relative, I should say, in the way you're describing, I can entirely derive why it makes sense to call a certain kind of experience bad, because that is what language is. It's to describe and differentiate between certain kind of experiences, certain kind of phenomena. And all I need to do that, to justify that, is nature itself. So, I don't know, I feel like at this point, we're we sort of will just be repeating ourselves because for some reason there just a disconnect there, and I'm not sure how to phrase it differently to.
No, yeah, you guys are good. I would definitely give Jimmy, or really any guest, the last word.
Yeah, please have the last word. I'm sorry if I talk too much.
But
no, not at all.
Would it be better for me to pose the one last question before we get off that I promised somebody I would ask you?
Yeah.
So would you prefer to get kind of get your last word before I do that, or no?
Go for the question. Go for it.
Okay, so someone had presented, and Lucas, you've been very patient, but he kind of came in about the veganism thing, and I tried to explain to him, like, this is, when we do an episode about veganism, it might be more relevant to the topic. But then it did become relative to the topic, and Lucas got his way about the morality thing. So I'm going to ask you guys both this question from your worldview. And I'll go ahead and just give my answer for him as a realist as well. Where does veganism, or this might be obvious for Cease's point, might be more towards Jimmy, but both of you, what about all sentient life in regards to like that well-being, and then Jimmy specifically with your worldview, like, you know, veganism? For me, to speak on myself as a moral realist, I just grant that vegans are morally superior to me. I don't have a good argument other than I think cheeseburgers taste good, and that's basically all I could give. So I would just basically admit that I'm morally inferior in that part. So there's that. If you can help my wallet out and things like that to make it so that I don't have these problems and things like that, and I can maximize the well-being of other beings, then I'm all about it. But the wallet hurts. So you two, if you guys want to answer that, start with.
I'll go first, and then I'll leave the last words to you. I know if we have other questions as well, but I want you to have the last word. I feel like I've I hope I didn't overtalk you at all in this conversation.
Not at all. No, I don't feel any. I'm not offended at all. I thought the conversation was very fruitful. So,
I'm not that educated on veganism and the morality aspect of these conversations in that context. I would say that from my limited understanding, it's probably indefensible, morally speaking, to eat meat. There may be people that have certain deficiencies that need to, and they may be outliers in that sense. I don't know. But certainly there's a real problem, morally speaking, with the killing of animals. And certainly the fact that the way our food system is set up, especially in this country, is that a lot of animals are abused before they arrive on the dinner table. And so I think it's probably fair to say that meat eaters are more moral. It's an immoral thing to do.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, my response would be, I would say, for the sake of argument, let's grant that something like veganism is true. Veganism just being the idea that it's morally superior to avoid the food products that a vegan diet avoids. Let's grant that. It seems to me that Christianity is unique and that there is a means to live out that lifestyle that grants people hope. It seems to me that morality is something human beings can hope for on Christianity, because even though we're born into sin, we stand condemned by God and we deserve his wrath, he is still gracious to people. Commonly, he offers societies a common sense of some kind of moral drive. People have an acquaintance with him to some degree, and so to that extent they have moral understanding, moral wisdom. And moreover, God himself got down into human flesh, died on a cross, and rose again, so that people who put their faith in Jesus are given the same power of the Holy Spirit that resurrected him from the dead. Those are Paul's words in Ephesians 1, that the same third person of the Trinity that empowered Jesus to do miracles is the same person of the Trinity that allows Christians to look for transformation, to live differently, and to seek reuniting with God and helping other people be reunited to God, and that through the gospel. So it seems to me like on Christianity, if veganism was true, you have a moral hope for seeking that kind of lifestyle, no matter how bad the globe looks, no matter how disastrous, no matter how much we're surrounded by futility and mayhem. There's hope in this world. But it seems to me that, like, from a naturalist point of view, even if you could somehow prove that there are these moral facts, it's really cold comfort, because apes throughout history have been pretty nasty creatures. Looks like they're still going to be pretty nasty. And at the end of time, the globe's going to blow up anyway. So, I mean, prudentially, you might as well live your best life now, careless of other people, because that's all you got.
So it's funny because the last thing you said is because of what you just described, the fact that life is finite from my perspective, it's actually reason to care about other people, to value my short life, to value empathy, because those things bring farther well-being, and because I have a limited time, I want to make the most of it, and making the most of it isn't hurting people. Making the most of it is helping people.
Okay, well, I'll let you end with that. I think I'll let my reasoning stand. But thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jimmy, thank you. I love this episode. I was going to chime in a lot more, but I really liked the dialogue between the two of you, and felt like you guys had that worked out a lot better in terms of for the audience sake than myself.
Awesome.
So I appreciate that. What I wanted to say real fast too, though, is that if anyone that did watch this or is watching this now and you like these types of conversations, please give us a sub. We try not to. I don't even know if in the 20 episodes I've asked anybody, but please, it helps us out. And also a shout out to Atheist Roundtable, Empathetic Atheist, JMD Apologetics 101, all the channels, Christian or atheist or whatever it might be, that are kind of building this community of conversations. It's huge for everybody. So when you're supporting JMD Apologetics, or you're supporting the Atheist Roundtable or the EA show, you're supporting us. If you're supporting us, you're also supporting them. We all support each other, and it helps the algorithm for the whole thing that we're doing here. So we really appreciate that. So whatever side you're on, please, it helps both sides out. The higher the number, the more guys like Rasmussen and Graham Oppie would potentially want to come on the show. So please help us out here.
Jimmy, thanks for coming on. I hope you'll come back at some point.
Yeah, dude. I really appreciate you guys. So, yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right, so my laptop's doing that thing where the fan sounds like it's going to take off, if you can hear that. And on that note, before my laptop takes off into space, we love you guys. Peace out. Thank you. And
see you guys.
Enjoy.
Talk soon.
Sweet.